he, of course, is going to man the chat. So if y'all have questions during the presentation, y'all can type them into the chat and Lorenzo will ask me. And then at the end, at a certain point, y'all can open your microphone at will and we can just talk, chit chat directly. You can ask questions directly. I don't think we're going to be a huge group today, maybe because I picked an oddball artist, as one of my friends accused me of doing. And so if we're not a huge group, then we can have some more chit chat. So thank y'all all for tuning in. Thank y'all all very much as well. I don't ever want to forget to tell you, thank y'all so much for the donations that you're sending in. Lorenzo and I both very much appreciate it, and that literally is what makes it possible for us to present these programs. So it's very, very much appreciated. And I also want to welcome the new people. We don't have a huge group, but there are actually several new people in the group. And so welcome. We're all we all have sort of formed this group during COVID. So I think everybody that signs into this, these Zoom virtual visits, we all kind of feel like we know each other by now. So we do have a couple of new people. If y'all want to write in to the chat how you heard about us and where you're tuning in from, everybody would like to know who's on the line with us. And I thank y'all for tuning in. So let's see. Lorenzo's got control of the microphones. Yeah. Y'all type in chats, questions in the chat. And then, let's see, I'm going to share my screen and we can get going. Let's see, 1 second.
And sorry for my terrible English.
Lorenzo's also, as many of y'all know, a cook. So he has, let's see, this needs to go away. There, no, will not go away. Okay.
Abbassalo.
Allora, Lorenzo, vedi
no.
bene? Cosa?
Lei. Abbassalo.
Abbassa cosa?
Ok, perfetto, così.
Okay, all right, that's good. Okay, so today, I wanted to tell you all about a couple of extra programs that I'm doing. I was asked to participate in an auction for Haiti. Hope for Haiti is a great charitable group which has been doing really good work in Haiti for I think 20 years now, particularly concentrating on water purification and schools and education as well, and kind of setting up new schools and training teachers in Haiti. And I'm going to do a program for them as part of an auction on the 14th of November. And we're going to do the Naples and Meatball program. So if any of y'all would like to support Haiti, let me know and I'll send you the information. Or if y'all are interested also in seeing the Meatball Naples program, you can catch it again on the auction for Hope for Haiti. And another special appearance is going to be at the 14th of November. On the 20th of November, Smithsonian Associates asked me to do a program for them. And so on the 20th of November, we are going to do the Pontormo and wheat and lasagna episode. So if any of y'all would like to tune in on Smithsonian Associates, let me know and I'll send you the information. All right, today we are going to visit Florence. We're going to talk about the artist Andrea del Castagno. We're going to look at how chestnut flour is made, and we're going to make a couple of recipes with the chestnut flour, which is super, super, super traditional to Tuscany, and the flavors are really perfect for this time of year. It's very fallish. So if you look at the map, these are the places we're going to visit. This is where I'm coming from, this little dot south of Florence. Here's the city of Florence. We're going to just take a quick peek at some of the major monuments. The artist called Andrea del Castagno is from a town called Castagno, which is the word for chestnut, which is right here. And then we're going to go to Pratomagno, my favorite mountainous area of Tuscany, where they make the chestnut flour. So first, just as a reminder, and for those of you who haven't seen it, this is where I live. This is in Tuscany at the Castle of Poppiano. And on the left is a photograph taken from the castle tower, so you can kind of see the rolling hills and what the countryside looks like. And then I live right down here, just outside the castle walls. And on the right, you can see my house. This is what it looks like right now. So the grapevines have all turned kind of bright yellow and red. This lasts for about 3 days. Like next week, all those leaves will be on the ground, it'll just be brown. But right now, it's really, really pretty. And then here's Pratomagno. I'm just going to show you quickly a little bit of what's going on down there. I've been down there a lot this week. I collaborate with a small organic farm called Sagona, and we started our olive oil harvest on Wednesday. So we have been very busy. Here's one of our collaborators. He's Robbie. And he's been a farmer for a long time. He's actually from Trentino, so kind of mountainy, and he's really good on those very steep terraces. So he's in charge of laying the nets out so the olives don't go rolling down the mountain, which is when you pick an olive, it's round, it will roll down the mountain if you don't stop it by, I don't know if you can't really tell in these pictures, but there are these little stakes in the ground so that the netting goes up, so the olives roll up in there and then just roll back down and stay in the net. And if you're not careful, then they just, you lose them. We don't want to lose them, because here they are. That's my business partner, Daniele Carotti of Sagona. He founded this small farm, a beautiful place, and the olive oil is absolutely excellent. And here's the first oil the olives going into the mill and the oil coming out. We're very proud of it. All right, so let's walk back in time into the city of Florence. So the artist we're going to talk about is called Andrea del Castagno. He was born in about 1419. They're kind of guessing on that. They're not super sure when he was born. I don't know they've looked for but haven't yet found his birth certificate. And the town was called Castagno, and it was north of Florence in the Florentine Apennines. It's a very mountainous region going towards Emilia-Romagna. And the main industry in town was timber. And the main client of this timber industry for the entire town of Castagno in the Mugello was the Duomo of Florence. That took them 200 years to build the Duomo. That's the structure you see on the right. You're looking at the bell tower and the dome of Brunelleschi and the side of the church. On the left, you see the baptistry, which actually predates the Duomo. So the Duomo took 200 years to build, and the wood was coming from Castagno. So Andrea is born, Andrea di Bartolo di Simone, Andrea, son of Bartolo, son of Simone, and in some point, somehow becomes an artist and moves to Florence. And when he comes to Florence, the dome of the Duomo has just been completed. And so the city basically looked like this. I'm trying to show you photographs of what the city looked like when Andrea del Castagno got to town. So I'm not showing you the facade of this church on purpose, because the facade was not built yet until the 1800s. So I'm just kind of showing you what it looks like, the way Andrea would have experienced it, which is that it's an enormous, humongous volume of a building plopped down into this little tiny medieval city. So just look at the scale of the figures here, and keep in mind it's no skyscraper, but they started this building in the year 1250. So think about what kind of materials they had and what kind of technology they had. So I mean, it was a feat. It was an absolute engineering feat. Getting that dome on there, that's a subject for another talk. But just think about the scale of this building. When you're in the little tiny lanes of the historic center, that picture on the right, you turn around and that is just like a wall of building just blocking you, blocking your vision of everything else. I mean, it's pretty amazing. It's got that wonderful, very kind of Florentine, Tuscan, alternating geometric images with the black and white and some pink as well, marble through there. Gorgeous building. So this and the other major monuments of Florence were in fact already built by the time Andrea del Castagno got to Florence. The wonderful Palazzo Vecchio, designed by designed by a guy who, for a period of time, was also the head architect for the Duomo, Arnolfo del Cambio. He would be a good topic for one of these sessions as well. So the beautiful Piazza Signoria, and then just walking down towards the river. I wanted to point this out. This actually was not here when Andrea del Castagno was here, because when Andrea was in Florence, this is the Uffizi. This was built in the 1550s. But when Andrea got to Florence in about 1430s, 1440, this was just a tiny little church called San Pier Scheraggio, which actually had been where the town council of Florence met before they built the Palazzo Vecchio. And then right here, you can see a corner of what is the mint. This is where the first gold florin was minted in the year 1252. And then walking down, you hit the river and you end up with the view of the Ponte Vecchio. This is the great Ponte Vecchio, which had been washed away by a couple of floods in the Arno, so they built it back to withstand any flood, and so far so good. This was built in 1345, and the Arno has flowed over its banks several times since then, and this bridge has held steady. Here's another great view of that romantic bridge. On the left from water level, on the right a view from the bridge looking down onto the river. If you go back into the historic center, oops, skipped one. This is Orsan Michele. I love this building. And these are all things, by the way, that you see just walking around Florence if you're going out to meet friends for lunch or if you're going shoe shopping. So if you're going shoe shopping, you're most likely going to walk by Orsan Michele. So this is the building. This was an old granary. And it was later, it was turned into a church. And it's got these gorgeous arches with these tracery windows. And then there are niches that go all the way around. And in the late 1300s, 1400s, these niches were given to kind of like they call them the guilds. It's almost like a labor union kind of a setup in a certain way. So these are guilds that were formed by the kind of professionals and then like groups like salespeople kind of thing. The word is escaping me, excuse me. The one we're about to look at here on the left, on the right, this is Donatello's statue of Saint Mark for the Artie dei Linaioli e Rigattieri. So it was kind of artisan skills, right? So these guys, though, actually worked with linens. They sold cloth for household linens and upscale used clothing like vintage, kind of like we have today. So this is Saint Mark that was done by Donatello for the Artie dei Linaioli. And the reason I'm going into particular detail here is because this guy was hugely influential on Andrea del Castagno. And these sculptures are all on the exterior of the building. So just walking through town, you can't help but run into Orsan Michele and then see all of these works of art. And there are several amazing artists represented on the outside of this building. Donatello has at least 2 sculptures here. And the one we're looking at here again is Saint Mark. And notice that the volume that this figure takes in the niche, the way that the artist has chosen to pose the figure, that's that pose called contrapposto, where he has all of his weight on the one leg here. So this is his weight-bearing leg. The other leg is not, and he's free to have his knee come out. So this knee pops out. The hip goes up, the shoulder comes out over here. So he's given some movement to the figures. This is kind of a new thing. So he's given movement to the figures. He has this kind of monumental, even the drapery itself is monumental. And there's some movement and energy there. And then that figure's got this piercing gaze. So remember that when we look at the paintings of Andrea del Castagno, because there's, it's kind of mirrors the work that Donatello did in sculpture. So Andrea del Castagno, when he gets to Florence, he sees things like Orsan Michele, and he definitely saw the work of Donatello and probably knew Donatello in person. So Andrea del Castagno arrived in Florence. We're not exactly sure when. We also don't know what his artistic formation is, but he, Lorenzo, mi stai passando sullo schermo?
No?
Oh, io non l'ho toccato, comunque. This is the Bargello. So Andrea del Castagno gets to Florence. We don't know what his background is, but he immediately in the year 1440 gets a super important commission from a super important patron. So the Bargello is today a sculpture museum. It was originally built in 1260 as the Palazzo del Podestà. So it's a government building. And at the time, the Republic of Florence is led by Cosimo de' Medici. And he chooses Andrea del Castagno to paint the exterior, to paint images on the exterior of the Bargello. And what he wants him to do is to paint effigies of his enemies. So he asks Andrea to paint effigies of his enemies hanging by one foot. So Andrea, that's a pretty big commission. Andrea, we think, is about 22 years old right now. So he's apparently a good enough artist to get this huge commission from basically the president. So we don't know how, again, we don't have any documents that tell us what his artistic formation is, but he's obviously a very good artist, and he's probably a good businessman as well. So he does these paintings of the enemies of the Medici family, and they're on view outside, on the outside of the Bargello, just like you see those works of art on the outside of Orsan Michele, visible to everybody. And they're there for about 50 years, and then they're taken down. They're no longer relevant, so down they come. But he made a name for himself by doing that. So he's in Florence. He got an excellent commission. He also gravitates toward this group of avant-garde artists. So last time that we were together, we were talking about Modigliani and Picasso in Paris in the 19-teens and how there was other art going on, but these guys were doing their own thing. Well, that's kind of happening here in the 1440s in Florence. So there's kind of the traditional style of painting, which is going on, and I'll show you that in a minute. But then there's this group of avant-garde artists. They're just doing their own thing. And what they're doing turns out to be what we decided to call the Renaissance later. So there's people like Donatello with St. Mark. You see that on the left. There's Masato. Masato is no longer present. He died when Andrea del Castagno was just a young boy. But he had huge impact on the world of, basically on Western art. So in Florence, he was a big deal. And this painting in the middle is Masato's Trinity, which is in Santa Maria Novella. And I feel sure that Andrea del Castagno, the artist, as soon as he got to Florence, went on a pilgrimage to Santa Maria Novella to see this painting. And what we're gonna look at closely today is the way that Masato, likely working with Brunelleschi, who designed the dome of the Duomo, mathematically calculated this perfect one-point perspective, which absolutely creates this illusionistic kind of 3D penetration of the wall, okay? It's like there is a hole cut into the wall to make that little barrel vault where you see God holding up the crucifix. And then on the right is Domenico Veneziano. He was a little bit younger than Donatello. He's a contemporary of Andrea del Castagno, and this is his St. Lucie altarpiece. This is kind of a famous work of art. It's extremely modern. Even just the fact that all the figures are in the same space at this time was modern. Again, illusionistic perspective. He has plotted out perspective here. You can kind of see how he's working that out on with the floor tiles. He's also influential for that very kind of, his very delicate color palette and the particular way that he uses light and the way light very gently models figures. So I'm pointing out things that all of these artists do that you're going to see in a second with the art of Andrea del Castagno. So Andrea gets to Florence, and these are the guys he's hanging out with. So we don't know where he came from, but we do know that this is what he's interested in, and these are the guys he's hanging out with. So he quickly gets another commission. 1445, he's asked to paint a refectory for this monastery. There's a Benedictine monastery right here. It's called Santa Apollonia. The exterior, of course, isn't just a heck of a lot to look at. The interior has that nice courtyard. I stole that picture out from the newspaper. That's why it says Firenze today. With that nice loggia. And there were some, they had artists come in and paint lunettes under the loggia, and they asked Andrea to come in and paint the refectory. So this is where the nuns had breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And quite kind of typically, they chose a scene of the Last Supper. And above that are scenes of the Passion of Christ. So this is a cloistered convent. Andrea was asked to come in here and paint these scenes, and then the doors were closed, and this convent was cloistered for 400 years, and nobody saw this work of art until in the 1860s, the state of Italy suppressed the monasteries, and all of a sudden this comes to light. So the majority, unfortunately, kind of a twist of fate, the majority of Andrea del Castagno's works have been lost. Churches were renovated, whatever, they're just not in existence anymore. So he's not, he hasn't been a huge name in the history of art for centuries because nobody had ever seen this. 1860, the doors are opened, and here's this masterpiece by Andrea del Castagno. So what he's done here is made this composition on the far end wall of this refectory, and he has constructed the scene to look like we are in a walled garden. You can see there's this brick wall right here. So we're inside this brick wall. There's a little tiny bit of greenery, tiny little bit. And then there's this kind of almost like Roman style triclinium that's been built there. And those walls come out toward us. So obviously one end is open so that we can see into the scene where Christ and the disciples are having the Last Supper. And then above that, on the outside of the wall, so on the other side of the wall is this kind of hilly landscape. And there's this one continuous hilly sort of undulations with three scenes from the Passion of Christ: the crucifixion in the middle, and then it's very ruined. It's very hard to see. We'll just take a quick look at this, though. It had actually been covered over with plaster, and someone discovered it even later than 1860. So the crucifixion, Christ's body being put into the tomb, and then the resurrection. So we'll take a closer look at that in just a second. So the idea here, though, is that the nuns they're in a cloistered convent, and the idea of these specific works of art is to kind of remind the nuns of the promise of everlasting life through faith in Christ. And of course, the Eucharist is such a big part of that. So let's take a look here close in on the Last Supper itself. So you can see he's kind of punched a hole in the wall like Masato did, and there's this dining room basically. And notice that there's 2 windows right here. There's also an actual window right here. So this light is coming in this way. This is very Domenico Veneziano-ish. So he's got a light source coming in here from this window. So as we look at some details, you'll remember that's where the light's coming from. So this kind of scene is often represented, and you've got 13 guys along a table, and it can get kind of boring. So the artist is trying to keep it from getting super boring. Another thing, they often looked towards the Bible, the Gospel of St. John for references here in order to construct the scene. But the abbess of this monastery seems to have given the artist a different text. And there is a German monk called Ludolf of Saxony, and he wrote about monastic life. He wrote about monastic buildings even. And there was one he kind of elaborated on the Gospel of John. So what in the Gospel of John, what you hear is that Jesus tells his disciples, I tell you, one of you will betray me. And they say, no way, who is it? Tell us, because we can't even believe this. And he says, it is the one to whom I will give the piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. And then Rudolph of Saxony adds, so that revelation of Judas Iscariot's betrayal entered each apostle like a knife, and they in turn reflected on their inner life and their eventual martyrdom. So that's the dramatic moment that's being depicted here. Every one of those apostles knows, Jesus sort of already knew what was going to happen, right? He kind of had the whole story already. And so he actually looks relatively calm. The disciples, though, are in shock. They now know that there's a traitor amongst them. Their brother, Judas, is going to turn in Christ. Christ is going to be killed by the Romans, and then they're all going to be persecuted and eventually martyred. So that's the information these guys are processing, and it's a lot. So Andrea he gets to work with all of that, right? So there's no boring composition of 13 guys in a line at a table. He's got all that going on. So there's no kind of repetition of figures at all. He's treated each one as an individual. He's also chosen these character types that are sort of, it looks like they, guys who he knew back home, basically. Somebody who came out of a sawmill, or kind of a nice little shepherd guy, right? They don't look like philosophers. They look more like, kind of real working class types of people. He's modeled them sculpturally. Look at this guy, big volumetric figures, heavy sculptural folds even. He's even kind of got this outline around the figures so that they almost look like they're figures that were placed on a little stage set in a certain kind of a way. And then the architecture in the back, he's chosen to use these alternating marble and porphyry panels, and then look at the one that is almost like a cut agate, the energy that's going on there. And it's kind of an agonizing energy. And of course, that's where the main action is taking place. So it draws your eye right in to Judas has just taken the piece of bread from Christ. Another little tidbit from Ludolf of Saxony is that he likes to point out that Jesus handed the piece of bread to Judas, and then he blessed it. So Judas didn't get the actual blessed Eucharist. He just had a plain old piece of bread. So Judas takes the bread, the devil enters him, and you can kind of see that Judas is kind of looking diabolical. Judas, of course, is on our side of the table, that we can kind of, let's mull that over a bit on your own time, because that kind of says a lot for us, right? We're trying not to be like that. So Christ, of course, already knows his fate. So he's, kind of accepted everything and knows what's going on. John is sleeping, and I think Peter's going like this. I just spent a few minutes trying to figure out what's going on with his hand. But Peter is in shock. He kind of looks haggard, and what happens with him, right? So he may have kind of gotten some foreknowledge of, the trouble he's about to find himself in. So Peter's kind of going like this. So each one is kind of basically wrestling with their own thoughts. This guy's looking up, kind of the thinker pose. This guy's looking down into his glass of wine, kind of meditating. The two guys down here, again, kind of rough looking figure here, they're discussing. And then if you zero in on them, you get these wonderful still lifes as well. It's almost like a Flemish still life here with these beautiful, very fine, delicate glass glasses and decanter for the wine. And I love the tablecloth as well. It's that kind of beautiful woven jacquard that's just been folded up, kind of, Martha Stewart didn't fold that, right? That's the way mine look, with all of these sort of, you can just see how somebody just shoved it in the cabinet, basically. Come down to the other end of the table. This is St. Andrew. I love the figure of St. Andrew, and he's the most sculptural of all of them to me. And this, he's holding bread, but he's also holding a knife, and he's looking at his neighbor, who is Bartholomew, and Bartholomew's fate is to be flayed alive, and Bartholomew's zeroing in on that knife. So he seems to kind of realize that his persecution is going to lead to martyrdom. And then the other three figures, they're the ones, these are the ones closest to the window. The fake window, the painted window. Notice how beautiful the light is on modeling their faces and their drapery and their hands and all of the actions of their hands. All three of these guys are just shock and despair. Look at this guy. He's just, absolutely can't believe it. So really, really cool interpretation of the text in order to kind of liven up this, this scene. So I love what he's done with the figures here. And if you look at the perspective, it's really interesting that Andrea del Castagno, who's hanging out with the people who are literally the guys who invented mathematical perspective. I mean, literally, that's who he's hanging out with. And they were kind of working together too. We were pretty sure that Brunelleschi worked with Masato on that Trinity, for example. And we know that Domenico Veneziano and Andrea del Castagno worked together. We have documents about that, so we know that. And Domenico was rigid with his perspective, as was Pier della Francesca, who we've talked about before. And I'm going to show you some more of their paintings. But Pier della Francesca was he was rigid about mathematically constructing perspective. So it's interesting to see that Andrea del Castagno definitely knew about that. He knew how to do it. If he needed some help, he knew where to get it, but he kind of chose not to do that. So from a distance, it looks great. And I was just in this room. I took all these photographs. So I'm walking through this room and it looks really good, but then you get up close and it just kind of doesn't hold water. It just doesn't, like even the, this is Judas Iscariot's stool. It almost looks like he's going to fall, right up on top of you. So the floor is supposed to look like receding red and white tiles maybe, but it's not really carefully done. And the same thing with the ceiling tiles. If a ceiling is going to recede into space, you have like a big square tile, and then they get smaller and smaller and get kind of pointy and get smaller as they go back into space. So that's how all of these guys have done this. Masato did it before, and we'll see Domenico Veneziano do it later. So he chose not to do that. He could have if he wanted to, but what he did, interestingly, is if you have really rigid one-point perspective, it looks really good to the viewer if the viewer's in one spot, but this is a refectory. And so if you got that seat one day and this other seat another day, if you're not in the one seat where you get the good view, it just doesn't make any sense. So what he did was he kind of fudged it a little bit, but he's got it so that maybe it's not totally perfect, but it basically looks good from everywhere. Like it works really well from everywhere. So everybody in the room has a good view. And in the end, I think he gives more weight to the emotional experience of this scene than the actual perfect depiction of reality. So I think he made that choice. And he makes a choice again. Let's look at that upper register. Again, this was horribly damaged, so it's really hard to see. But you've got the resurrection here. Look at it a little bit more. This is the picture I took too. His colors are kind of different. But here you can see he's got Christ coming up out of the tomb. The Roman soldiers are sleeping at the base. The tomb itself mimics those marble panels that he has that are along, the backs of the heads of the apostles in the Last Supper. And he's kind of played with the perspective here too. So he feels like he can take artistic license on the perspective. And while I haven't actually been working as an art historian for many years, I do have a master's degree in art history, and I have worked in art history, but I've been making chestnut flour in the meantime. And so when I put these programs together, I kind of start studying, and sometimes I remember things I had forgotten, and I just saw something that I don't know if I ever knew this, but I just saw this. So remember Pier della Francesca, those of you who are on the line. So here we go. Santa Apollonia, 1447, Andrea del Castagno paints this resurrection of Christ. He's in this group. He's in the group with Domenico Veneziano. We have documentary evidence that link Domenico Veneziano and Andrea del Castagno, and we have documentary evidence that links Domenico Veneziano and Piero della Francesca. So let's just say they knew each other, and they pretty much knew each other, because you can see that right here. So again, in this convent also, as soon as the paint was dry, the door was closed and nobody saw this thing for 400 years. But when an artist does a fresco, they make those cartoons, life-size drawings, and certainly this was sketched out many times before he went to transfer this to the wall. So my point being that Piero della Francesca, who painted his resurrection, the one you see on the right, 20 years later, after the death of Andrea even, in the town hall in San Sepolcro. So if y'all were on the line for the porchetta lesson, y'all remember looking at this. So it's interesting, clearly, they've both learned the palette from Domenico Veneziano, those kind of delicate colors. And Piero clearly, basically liked that composition, let's put it that way. And then they also both used this kind of weird artistic license with the perspective, which for Andrea, we already know he does that, but Piero della Francesca doesn't do that very much. I saw an exhibition of Piero della Francesca paintings where they had actually made 3D models using his math, basically. I mean, he calculated this stuff so precisely, but here he decided to show us the group of sleeping Roman soldiers and the tomb as if we're looking up at it. You can actually see under their chins, and you see Christ straight on it. And look at that penetrating gaze of Christ straight on. It's super effective. And I actually think that maybe Piero's composition is a little bit more effective than Domenico Veneziano's, but let's give Domenico Veneziano some credit, So I'm just going to show y'all quickly some influence that these guys had and kind of what was different about what they were doing as opposed to other artists. So this 1447 right here, this is 1465, Piero, and then this is 1472 in Florence from Neri di Bicci, of the great Bicci family of Florentine painters. And there's some modern elements here, but just to give you an idea, there's some holdover to kind of the old-fashioned style of painting while other artists were doing other things. So Masacci's painting his Trinity, Donatello is sculpting things like the David and the Saint Mark, Domenico Veneziano's painting the St. Lucie Altarpiece, Piero della Francesca, that's his wonderful Baptism of Christ at the National Gallery in London, and then of course Andrea del Castagno. So these guys are what we now call the Renaissance. Like this became the prevailing style, and they paved the way for artists like Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael. So those are kind of the more big names, I guess. But you can see, I'm going to show you just quickly a painting by Michelangelo. Remember the way that Andrea del Castagno kind of uses sculptural forms to paint figures and uses that outline, that really precise contour around the sculpture, around these sculptural figures that kind of almost look like they've been put into a sculpture garden in this case. So this is Michelangelo's Donnie Tondo, painted in 1505 for Agnolo Donnie on his marriage to Maddalena Strozzi. So it's interesting to see how much influence all of those artists, including Andrea, had on an artist like Michelangelo and his contemporaries, of course, as well. So just to finish up with our image of the Last Supper, Andrea del Castagno painted this in the late 1440s. He died about 10 years later in an epidemic of the bubonic plague. So unfortunately, he died in 19 August, 1457. His contemporaries called him a great artist. They knew he was an influential person for this new movement of painting, which we call the Renaissance. He got great commissions from super important patrons. Literally 2/3 of his known works are gone. And so the very few works that are left are in great museums. And then there's this, which is considered his masterpiece. But again, it was hidden for 400 years because it was in this cloistered convent. So he's kind of, not quite as well known as some of the other artists who maybe get a lot of airtime because they just have had more presence in the art history books for longer. But I'm happy to be able to give Andrea del Castagno a little airtime. I think he's a great artist. Here's what he looked like. He was, from the Mugello, from this little town called Castagno. So he was born Andrea di Bartolo, but he ended up kind of given the name of the town, Andrea del Castagno, kind of like Leonardo da Vinci. But the cute thing here is that Andrea made such a name for himself that Castagno, the town, is now called Castagno dell'Andrea. The town actually took the name of the artist. It's really cute. So they're here in this very mountainous region where all of the mountainy regions of Tuscany. There's also the Garfagnana near Lucca, this area in the Mugello, Pratomagno, where we're going to go, full of chestnut forests, and there's this big tradition of kind of working with chestnuts. So here is Piero Dogolini, who on the left there, he took me out on the 29th of September one day, and we went up into the mountain, and he said, San Michele la castagna e nel paniere. And I said, huh? What does that mean? And he said, well, today is the feast day of St. Michael. And on the feast day of St. Michael, you go up and start picking up chestnuts. So your chestnut hull gets toasted and eaten while the chestnuts are fresh, but of course chestnuts are going to go bad. So in order to preserve them, and this has been done for centuries, and the food calories in the chestnut are important, just like the food calories in, milk are important, right? But if you can't preserve it in the refrigerator, then you have to turn it into something else. So you turn milk into cheese, and you can turn chestnuts into chestnut flour. So you've actually got a source of calories and protein for the next year. So that's what these guys do. They pick up chestnuts, and I mean, there's a period where everybody in the family was out there. I'm talking about peasant, self-sustaining, self-sufficient peasant farmer families. Everybody's up on the mountain collecting chestnuts. And then they put them into the secatoio, which is like a smokehouse, basically. So you can see how it works with a fire on the bottom, coals, basically, not a flame, because here there are wooden slats that then hold up all these chestnuts, and they're there for several months. They start picking them up in the end of September, and they toast them until, I think, after Christmas. So here's what the inside of one looks like. The upper floor has this tiny little door, and you dump all your chestnuts in, and you can see it's smoky, right? You can just see all the smoke in here. And then on the bottom floor is this constant, very low fire. And it's kind of fun because this is during the winter. So the fire, of course, is warm. It's dang freezing outside. So everybody comes inside and chit-chats to stay warm. But, there's smokes up to about here. And so you have to sit down low. So all the stools have these little legs about that tall, so you can sit way down so you're below the smoke level. And then there's also coals all the time. So most of the secatoi smokehouses have one of these little grills. So you can just bring your own sausage or bring your own steak, and you can just grill whatever you want for supper when you're in there chit-chatting. This is what the upstairs looks like. So this is when it's full of chestnuts. And you can see these are two different secatoi, but they each have kind of a similar tool for kind of moving those chestnuts around. And then when they're done, you can open up the slats and you just kind of let them all fall to the ground floor. So then they're shucked, and then they're toasted again. And on Pratomagno anyway, they toast them again in a wood-burning oven, like this guy Beppe has his wood-burning oven. And then they are painstakingly picked through by hand, put into sacks, and taken to the mill. So here is there were 14 mills along the Cefena River way back in the day, water-powered mills. There are 2 left, one in Lower Cefena, one in Rocco Ricciarda. Here's the mill pond, and the miller has a mechanism where he can actually open a chute, so the water from the mill pond rushes down here and spins the paddle wheel. Can you see that? I'll show you a close-up of it, but that's how that works. So the paddle wheel spins, and then the millstones obviously spin. So here's Beppe and his mill. Here's the mechanism. He can kind of use this mechanism here is this chain. You lift the chain and you open the chute so the water can come in. And then this mechanism here, actually, I'm not sure what, somehow it's hooked up to the millstones. There's 2 millstones in here, and with that he can change the distance between the millstones depending on what he's grinding. So if he's grinding chestnuts, it looks like this. The chestnuts come in down the little trimoja into the millstones, and out comes the chestnut flour. It's also, and here it is for sale, farina di castagna. They also call it farina dolce, sweet flour. So here's some recipes that you can make with chestnut flour. And these, there's kind of a variety of things that you can make. We're gonna make these. Somebody asked me already in an email where you can get chestnut flour, and I'm going to tell you tomorrow exactly where you can get chestnut flour. You can mail order it in the United States. So these are all the ingredients that I'm going to use. I'm going to take screen sharing away. Come siamo, Lorenzo?
Bene, abbassa ancora un po'.
Abbassa.
Sì, ancora un po'.
Basta però.
Sì, ok.
Ma così. Mi sa. Non mi piace. Hang on one second. Never mind. I'll get rid of it. So we are going to make this bread called Pane Martino, and St. Martin's Day is in November, and so maybe it's just kind of a fall flavor. I'm not sure how chestnut flour is associated with St. Martin, but so first step is, this is warm water, still warm. I'm going to dissolve my yeast. This is the kind of yeast I get here. It's cake yeast, baker's yeast. Y'all, I think, usually get the granules. So just follow the package directions. But I'm just going to dissolve some yeast in warm water. This bread is really, really simple. It's super flavorful, and it's no knead bread is what it is. It requires extremely little effort. So you can make chestnut flour bread with all chestnut flour, but the old timers call it pan di legno, wooden bread, because it's just really, really heavy. It is quite flavorful, but you have to eat it in kind of small amounts. And the old timers, in any event, they literally lived off of chestnuts. So now that they don't have to live off chestnuts, they really are not that interested. We, of course, have the benefit of being able to add some other flour to it to kind of lighten it up. So the recipes that we're making today, one of them I used all chestnut flour, but two of them I went ahead and we're going to use some white flour as well. So this is just regular flour. And I'm going to add the chestnut flour, which it kind of tends to, so I can just get it in the grocery store. Or I can get it at the mill, but the mill, theirs are not ready yet because they haven't even picked up all the chestnuts yet, or they're in the smokehouses. So I went ahead and got it at the grocery. It tends to clump a little bit, so you really do need to either sift it or just use a whisk. And that's the reason I have a whisk here, is just to kind of, I'm pretending like I'm sifting. It works just as well as a sifter. So just to make sure that it doesn't have any lumps. Let's see. I'm going to put in just a little bit of salt. And this is all dissolved. So this is just hot water, the yeast. I'm going to add a little bit of olive oil. So this just gets mixed up. Just trying to kind of slowly incorporate everything. And again, you don't even have to knead it. You just stir it up, form it, place it on the pan, let it rise, stick it in the oven. There's no punching it down. It's just really simple. And it's not a huge fluffy loaf by any means, so that's kind of not the point. So mixing everything together, I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of olive oil, about. I guess I can go like this, I have a spoon. So you have to get your hands slightly dirty for this. I'll take off my ring. So once all the flour is incorporated, you just add some walnuts. There are other recipes that use actual chestnuts, but we're not doing that today. We're just concentrating on the flour. And then using actual chestnuts is a little bit difficult because they're kind of hard to find, and they're super hard to peel without just losing a finger. We don't want that. Okay, so let's add walnuts. Now I'm just going to mix all this together. So you just form a ball with the dough. It's a real sticky dough. Put it on a pan. Can y'all see that? I'm gonna leave my, I actually got some walnuts for show. So put it on an oiled pan. And it's going to go directly in the oven from here. So I'm going to kind of get some oil on my fingers so I can form it without just sticking everywhere. So there, and I'm just going to kind of poke small holes in it. Not holes, just little dimples. And then it sits here, I'm going to cover it. It sits for about an hour, and then it goes directly in the oven. It does kind of flatten out a little bit. It doesn't make a big, round, fluffy loaf. It just kind of makes more of a flat loaf. But again, it's really, really flavorful. It tastes like fall. I'm going to show you some different ways to use it with some cheese. We're even going to do some in the broiler with some lard. It's going to be so good. So just cover it up, let it sit, ideally in kind of a warm place, for 1 hour, and then into the oven, and you're good to go. So that is the bread. Now we're going to make some pasta. Chestnut flour pasta is really good with a variety of different condimenti on top of sauces. And again, it's really fall, so it's just kind of fun to have all these good fall flavors. And I'll send y'all a couple of options for the sauces. Today we're going to make a ragu. Actually, Lorenzo gave me the idea. So, hang on, I'll tell you this. We're going to use chestnut flour. And then a mix of regular flour and semolina. And the miller this time, the semolina is like really coarse corn flour. I don't know what he was thinking. I'm kind of wiping my whisk here just to get some clumps out, and then I'm going to go to the fork. So y'all seen me do this before. I'm just going to put this dough together, and then I already have it needs to rest, so I've got one resting. So I'm going to make the well. Let me add some salt. This is the typical way to make pasta. And Lorenzo, non è detto che tu facevi questo con la tua nonna, giusto?
Sì, esatto. This kind of when we put the flour over the table, we say we make a fountain of flour. And with my granny, we put only 1 egg for, and we try. And I try to don't spread all the flour in all the rooms of the kitchen.
And you have to be kind of careful. So your grandmother only gave you 1 egg?
No, only 1 egg per volta.
Oh, okay. At a time. Okay. So I'm using 4 eggs. This recipe I for 4 eggs.
And I use my finger, not the fork.
Oh, I don't like to get sticky, so I'm going for the fork. So you just slowly incorporate flour. And this recipe is a little bit, there's no gluten in chestnut flour. So it's a good gluten-free flour, but it also makes it so, like the bread, for example, if you don't use regular flour as well, it's really, really just tough. I mean, it's good. It's got a good flavor, but it's not at all light. It is like, like I said, the old timers call it wooden bread because it's basically like a piece of wood. It is flavorful, but it's just so heavy. And then the pasta tends to be a little bit less elastic. And since I'm never satisfied basically with anything, I've been kind of playing around with this recipe. So the original recipe has a little bit of milk and a little bit of olive oil in it, and I just thought that seemed ridiculous. And so I decided for the dough that I've already made to just, because there's plenty of egg in here to hold together, so I decided to do that. But it is a little bit easier to work if you use a tap of milk and just a little bit of olive oil. So I think for this one, I'm going to go ahead and do that. Just a teensy bit of milk. For some reason, this is the lovely milk package. And then a tiny bit of olive oil. This just makes the dough a little bit more pliable and a little bit easier to work with. So the sauce that we're going to put on this is, we're going to make a white ragu. which I usually actually put things like squash and leeks on here, or maybe even, sometimes I just put in caramelized onions with a little bit of like crumbled pancetta or bacon. Those flavors all go just really well together. The chestnuts and the squash is really good. The chestnuts with the onions and the bacon. Today we're going to do a white ragu, which actually is another Lorenzo recipe. And it's got sausages and porcini mushrooms. So just think about how good those flavors are with the chestnuts and how just so much like fall, really good fall flavors. So this is coming together, it's still kind of shaggy. This does need to get worked just a little bit, not necessarily needed, but this needs to be incorporated really well. So these are sort of modern day recipes. The old folks up on the mountain, like Piero, who you saw a picture of, or his friend Cosimo, for example, and his wife, Mrs. Lorini. Those guys ate pulenda or polenta. They called it pulenda. And they grew up on that, and they literally ate it like twice a day, every day, because you know, that's what the families had to eat. They didn't really have a lot of options. So they ate this chestnut polenta, and they'll tell you, we ate it every day for breakfast and supper, and then they go, and we were happy. You know, it's kind of like I used to walk X number of miles to school in the rain, what are you complaining about kind of thing. That's kind of how they affront the chestnut flour discussion. So when times were tough, there were always chestnuts. And there are people in the villages on that mountainside that literally, older people who literally give their life to the fact that there were chestnuts. They said during the war, there was no food during the war. There was no, you know, the men were gone, nobody was farming. You know, women had gardens, but you know, the wheat farming wasn't being done. And so there was no bread. I mean, they really did not have food. So the fact that they had chestnuts and could go and just kind of literally forage them from the mountainside, I mean, they literally credit their lives with the fact that the chestnuts got them through. So there's the dough, and it's a little bit sticky, so I'm going to put some flour on it. And then this needs to kind of rest. And because it's sticky, I'm not going to put it in plastic wrap. I'm going to go ahead and let it have some air. So we can make some pasta with, this is a super soft dough. You actually could probably roll this out pretty easily with a rolling pin. And there are some recipes for chestnut flour pasta that are kind of a form of pasta you might call maltagliati, where you just make a sheet of pasta and then just cut it any old way. I was going to make tagliatelle. Actually, we'll see what this turns into. So it's a super soft dough. And this is my experiment with no oil and no milk. So it's not super easy to work with. The first go round, as y'all may recall, is never, well, it comes out kind of shaggy, so you have to kind of work with it. Still really sticky, so I'm just going to give it some flour. So Lorenzo, a te piace la pasta or no? Lorenzo's not really into chestnut flour, but
I don't like chestnut.
not even the pasta though, because you put some of your flavors on the pasta.
Yeah, the only way to eat for me chestnut is in pasta, because it's not all chestnut flour, but it's also white flour. And you normally use a very strong sauce like pork or other sauce that it should be very good together. Yeah.
He's trying to hide the flavor basically with some pork on top. So it comes together. I'm also, because it's kind of a delicate dough, I'm not going to make it, roll it out very thin. I'm going to keep it kind of thick, but it makes a nice pleasant sort of
the dough that you make is for 100 people.
Dishi.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm also going to try to, I don't want the edges to be too shaggy. I always try to, I'm going to do it into thirds so I can get some nice clean edges. All of that really does not matter for one bit. So, let's see. Okay. I'm going to do it kind of short. This one wants to be short. Ideally, you would let this kind of rest between folds a little bit, being such a delicate dough. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this into tagliatelle, and I'm going to just do it with my dough scraper, because my tagliatelle cutter is broken. But really, you can also, if you were had used the milk and oil in here, I would fold it and cut it this way, just to make quicker work out of it. But I didn't, so now I know.
Or you can use a knife.
Or I could use a knife, but there's nothing in here, so I'm using my dough cutter, which is perfectly. Or there's another thing. There's a recipe. There's actually a recipe. This is from the Lunigiana area, which is Liguria, which is near Cinque Terre, that area. And they make a chestnut flour pasta. Now it has a really particular name in dialect. I think it's called mesh and castagne or something like that. But they make these. They make shapes like this out of it. These kind of rhomboid shapes, really rough rhomboid shapes. And they probably do that because this dough is so kind of delicate. Theirs look like this. They tend to eat it plain with just some cheese on it. Olive oil and a ton of cheese. Even just Parmesan cheese on top of the chestnut pasta is really good. So these are the mesh and castagne that you can do in the video. That's a very good one. So there you go. All right, so we're going to go into the kitchen and make sauce for the pasta and take a look at the bread. Okay, so I'm going to move y'all into the kitchen. Vediamo qua, Lorenzo.
Abbassa. Ok, perfetto.
Allora, forse così?
Sì.
Okay, so let's see. Here's the bread. This is what the bread looks like when it's done. It's really beautiful, kind of very rustic looking bread. And you can see it kind of comes out, it kind of flattens out a little bit. I also used that ancient grains flour, which has very little gluten. The gluten's very weak, so it doesn't fluff up a lot. If you use like real bread flour or something, it might fluff up for you. I'm just going to show you what it looks like on the inside, and then where's my knife? And then we're going to make the pasta sauce. Dovevo iniziare, Lorenzo, con le salsicce.
Sì. Però ormai.
Lo faccio adesso or no?
No, dai, finisce questo.
Okay, so here's the bread when you cut it open. You can see all those walnuts on the inside. It's got this really nice, kind of nice and moist, yummy. And it can be kind of jazzed up a little bit, which is something my mother would say, by adding a piece of pecorino cheese or a piece of lard, for example.
It's the same reason for the same reason. To cover the flavor of chestnut.
Cover up the flavor. I think it's just a great flavor pair because the kind of tangy sheep's milk cheese goes really well with this, and so does that real kind of salty taste of the pork. So let's put this on. I'm going to run this under the broiler, and I'm going to make a little bit of toast, and then I'm going to flip it over and put the toppings on. So I'll show you all the toppings. I have, this is a kind of semi-aged sheep's milk cheese, really tangy, kind of sheepy, and it just contrasts really well with the sweetness of the chestnut flour. And then so that's one. I'm keeping an eye on the broiler here so I don't burn everything. And then my butcher, handily, when he takes the fat off of the prosciuttos, he turns it into lard, like lard bicicolonato. So this is basically just cured. It's like, you know, you cure prosciutto or you cure bacon. This is cured lard, and it's so yummy. And it just they spice it up so well. And then just look how it's transparently cut. See how thin it is? You don't need much, and it just kind of melts on top of that bread and soaks in. So I'm going to take this. I don't want this to get burned, but I'm going to flip it over. So it's kind of toasty on the bottom, and then I'm going to add a little bit of olive oil, because olive oil also kind of bitterness in the olive oil contrasts really, really, really well with the might use this one, with the kind of sweet flavor of the chestnut flour.
Elaine, puoi spostare quel foglio bianco che non si vede quello che stai facendo dietro?
Sì.
Ok.
Faccio così, grazie. The white in the zooms bleach out really quick. Really badly, I see. Okay, so then I'm just going to load up some lard on here, because why not? Just be so good. Okay, let's just put that back in the broiler. All right, so while those are just the cheese is kind of gonna melt down, and then the lard is gonna melt as well. And we'll get going on the pasta sauce. So the pasta sauce starts with I don't know why it's doing that there. Sofrito. Lorenzo, li vuoi dire te che cos'è un sofrito?
Yeah, normally we use some vegetables like onions, celery, and carrots, and sometimes parsley, and we chop with a knife. It depends on what kind of preparation you do. For example, for sauce, you have to chop very thin and put together in a pan with a little bit of olive oil. When in Italian say a little bit of olive oil, is normally half a liter of olive oil. You know that. We use a very lot of olive oil. And then you put it over the fire, and you wait that it doesn't fry, but we say soffriggere. Elaine, help me. I don't know if there is an English word for.
Basically over low heat, right? Or kind of medium heat. Until the vegetables, I've got a head start, so these vegetables have already been cooked down. And I've chosen, because of the recipe here, I've chosen to use celery, carrot, and some garlic. But you can see the piece of garlic there in the middle of the pan. I did chop it up. I kept it whole, because that way I can then take the garlic out. That also helps me keep the garlic from burning. And then I've added a bay leaf because I think the bay with the pork is going to be really good. We're going to use pork here. And then also the chestnut flavor. So what Lorenzo just described is so common to Italian cooking that in the grocery store, so these are called odori. And then when you go to the grocery store, you buy a little box of odori. And the odori, there's an onion and just some parsley shoved on in the box and some celery and some carrot. Because that's you have to have it. No matter what you're making, you have to have a sofrito. I'm gonna turn this off. Okay, so it's just really finely chopped. Again, carrot, celery, and I chose to use garlic just because I'm not an onion person, and the garlic is going to be really good with the bay and the chestnut. So everything just gets chopped up together, super fine. And you can chop the garlic if you want to. I prefer just to make sure that it doesn't burn because it really bothers me. And then you can take it out. So usually when you leave garlic whole like that, it releases all of its flavor into the oil. And then you can take the big piece of garlic out before you serve. If you're going to do a ton of this, you can also do it in the food processor, being super careful not to just reduce it to paste, but you do want it to be really finely minced, so that can help. So you can kind of see how far down I'll let it cook, just because you can see what I just added to the pan as compared to what was in there before. So you really let it cook down a good bit. It doesn't take long. I mean, it probably takes sort of 8 or 10 minutes. And then, so we're going to make what's called a white ragu. And I've decided to just use pork. I'm not using any beef. You could use beef or veal. I'm just using pork. And I just bought some sausages from the butcher. And you can actually just use regular ground pork and add salt and pepper yourself, or buy sausages already spiced up. My butcher sausages are so flavorful that I actually like to use, I kind of prefer his flavor, but there's no fennel in here. So if you can't find sausage without fennel in it, then either use literally breakfast sausage or just get ground pork that doesn't have anything in it. And then so the sausages are just gonna get kind of broken up in here. I actually asked the butcher if he had any, what do you call it? Lorenzo, come si chiama la salsiccia che non è dentro in... Basically, like just the ground up sausage with no, not in the casing, just to make life easier, but he didn't.
No.
So, the casings. And this reminds me though of, if you're in Emilia-Romagna, right at the top, right where Tuscany hits Emilia-Romagna in that very mountainous area, kind of like where the artist Andrea del Castagno comes from, they eat pesto. And so you're thinking, oh, y'all have some pesto. Well, the pesto, though, is basically, it's pork. It's pork in the mortar and pestle, and it's just mashed up pork with all the spices, and they eat it raw on a piece of hot bread. It is so good. L'hai mangiato, Lorenzo?
Yeah. We have a question for lard, and Jan say, how would you call the type of lard you are using? Not sure, I've seen it this way in States, so we can get lard here, but it's more like a butter.
Oh, right.
And
so,
come in a jar.
Giusto. Okay, so yeah, that lard, the lard that you're thinking of is the cooking fat, basically. I don't know what they call that in Italian. That exists in Italian too. They call it strutto.
Yeah, it's different.
Lard. And so this lard is actually like, I'll actually tomorrow when I send you the recipes, I'll send you a picture of the butcher holding it up. It looks like a cut of bacon that's just been cured. And they cure it the way they cure things here, with just covering it with salt and pepper and spices and then letting it sit at the proper temperature and humidity until it kind of cures. So it's not just raw fat, it's actually cured fat. But if you can't, and it basically tastes like the fat on the prosciutto or the fat on pancetta, for example. And it is basically belly fat. So you could use pancetta, which is cured pork belly, which I know you can find that. So you may not be able to find lard, but you can for sure find the pork belly, which is pancetta. All right, so we're just going to let this cook down.
I make my own lard.
Okay.
I make my own lard. I buy a piece of lard and I make it with some spices, and I have in my fridge.
I didn't know that. That never occurred to me. Never occurred to me to make my own lard. But maybe I'll try that now that you mention it.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm going to let this cook. When it gets to a certain point, I'm going to add some white wine, let that cook down, and then we're going to add porcini mushrooms. And the porcini season is just finished over here. And it's not always easy to find actually good porcini mushrooms. A lot of times they're imported and they're not that great. And so I'm using dried porcini, which I've already have sitting in hot water. And so I'm trying to find a good piece that looks like a mushroom. So you can see just nice porcini mushrooms sitting in hot water. So we'll use the mushrooms themselves and a tiny bit of liquid. And the mushrooms just come, here's how they come. They just get dried. And these are actually from Pratomagno. I bought them in the grocery. Pratomagno Funghi made these. And the old timers used to do this. They would put them on a string. They would go pick up their mushrooms, you know, in the forest while they were picking up their chestnuts, and slice them thick, and they kind of run like a big needle through them and just hang them up to dry. And then so when they're not in season, you still get some good mushroom flavor. And the mushroom flavor is so good with the pork and then together with the chestnuts, and it's just like so sort of fall, wintry, mountainy flavors. So I want the pork to really cook down, kind of start to get brown before I add the wine. So while that's working, I'm going to show y'all. I also made castagnaccio, which is kind of a funny recipe, and it's similar. I'm not actually demonstrating it to you because it's very similar to that farinata, the torta di ceci we made in Livorno, and it's basically chestnut flour and water and poured into a pan. So I didn't really feel the need to demonstrate that. I think it's so simple. And it's a funny recipe because Tuscans eat this for dessert. And I have a friend who's lived here for probably 30 years, and she's married to a Tuscan guy, and she calls this the worst food surprise in all of Italy because it kind of looks like it's going to be a brownie. It is not a brownie. So Tuscans actually, again, this is a poor kind of peasant farmer tradition. So this is dessert. It's sweet flour because it's the chestnut flour, and there's some raisins in there. And there's walnuts, pine nuts, and rosemary. That is just not dessert. But I mean, if you are living in the kind of condition where there isn't any sugar and you're lucky to have maybe even a little bit of honey, well, then this is dessert. Although if you were eating chestnut flour polenta twice a day, I don't know that you really even want to see this. But so this is castagnaccio, and it's kind of a thing where, like, Lorenzo, do you like this?
No.
No, even Lorenzo doesn't like it. It's really particular.
My granny makes a very wonderful castagnaccio, and my brother and my uncle beat them because they want to eat, and I cannot eat it because I don't like. It's strange.
Well, so my friend calls it the food surprise because you think you're getting a brownie. Anyway, my thing is, it's not my favorite thing in the world, but at least once a fall, you kind of need to eat it. But it's actually, to me, it's better with maybe a piece of pecorino cheese and a glass of red wine.
It's a cake.
Huh?
It's a dessert. Not.
But no, he's laughing at me because I eat it as if it were an antipasto with red wine and cheese. He's like, well, no, it's a dessert, but it's a kind of grossest dessert. Like, it's actually better if you have some cheese and wine with it, I think. Or you could actually have it with the cheese course. Or you could just eat like cheese and salad for supper and have a slice of that. And I mean, it is, I mean, here, let me cut it for y'all, and I'll show you how it looks. It's kind of this weird rubbery, kind of an odd consistency. So you want to serve it in relatively small pieces because you don't want to eat that much of it. Let me see if I can get a piece that shows you the So this is what it looks like. It's just kind of thin. It kind of looks like that tortilla. There's some raisins in there. I'm telling you, Lorenzo, con un pezzo with a piece of cheese, it's really not bad.
Oh.
In fact, we're having a little appetizer plate over here. It also, if it's kind of dry on top, it has olive oil in it, but you can pour a little olive oil on top. All right, so I hope I haven't just convinced y'all to never make this. It's actually, it's super traditional, and actually, I mean, it's not the kind of thing you maybe want to eat every single day, but like it's one of those recipes maybe you make for nostalgia, but it's quite good with other things, right? So, let's see if I can arrange this somehow.
Sounds like fruitcake.
It's kind of like fruitcake, but I mean, again, if you put a piece of cheese next to it, it's doable. I like it better with a little bit of oil in it. So here's kind of a nice, two different kind of appetizers, I guess. This is what the lard like shriveled up, but it dripped all of its fat down into the bread before it did so. And then this is so good with the tangy, melty sheep cheese on top of the kind of sweet bread. And then this really, honestly, this is a good, just kind of bite-sized appetizers with some kind of tangy cheese next to it and a glass of wine. It's quite good. And it's just different and interesting. And again, gluten-free. And it's good.
Lei l'acqua della pasta?
Grazie. So the sauce, or white ragu, I'm going to add some wine. I'm going to turn up the flame and add some wine. Then we'll add the mushrooms and we'll be done. So putting salt in the water. Lorenzo said when an Italian recipe says to add olive oil, they mean a lot. And when they say to add salt to the water, they mean a lot. So as soon as that comes to a boil, I'll throw some pasta in. And then I'll show you really quickly the porcini mushrooms. So you just want to squeeze the water out. And I'm going to chop these really coarsely because I want them to kind of be present in the sauce. It's not even really a sauce, it's kind of a spare condiment. So I don't want them to disappear. So I'm going to keep them kind of big. And then you're going to use some of the liquid too, but the liquid often contains little bits and pieces that you don't want in your food. So I'm going to run it through a strainer. So those go in when the alcohol from the wine is burned off. And then I'm going to just add a little bit of the mushroom liquid. Che dici, Lorenzo? Basta?
Sì. Lascialo un po' cremoso.
Okay. So that just kind of cooks, all those flavors will meld. I'm going to throw the pasta in as soon as this gets going. So here's the pasta I made earlier. So I did make tagliatelle out of it, and it turned into tagliatelle. But it might be easier to just use one of those other formats of pasta, like the lozenges that they make in Liguria. So fresh pasta takes no time at all to cook. Sort of 2 or 3 minutes and it's done. here's some sauce that's already I have prepared this afternoon. And I don't know if y'all can see the colors. I'll hold it up for you. So when it just kind of cooks, all the flavors come together and it kind of turns this nice, just kind of, you know, wintry brown with all of the mushrooms in there. I'm going to swap places too. All right, so the pasta, look, it's already floating. Usually that's a sign that that it's ready. See? I made them, remember I cut them really thick. I'm going to give them an extra minute because I don't want to have any kind of raw flour flavor. So even though they're floating, I'm going to let them go another minute. And I'm going to drain them directly into the sauce. I'm going to just lift them up out of the pan and put them into the sauce because as you can see, the sauce itself is pretty spare. And so the little bit of starchy water that is still attached to the pasta is going to go down into the sauce and kind of help give it a little bit of body. And then what you always want to do when you cook pasta in any event, in almost every instance, you want to saute the pasta in the sauce because the pasta, a good pasta in any event, especially a homemade one like this, will absorb, literally absorb liquid. And so it's going to absorb the yummy liquid of the sauce I just made. So it basically is just a way to kind of increase the flavor. So I'm just going to kind of delicately mix this through here. And then I'll put it on a plate and show you all what it looks like. If anybody has any questions, if y'all want to undo your microphones, comments or questions.
Elaine, did you say your sausage did have anise in it or not? It did not.
No. Yeah, you don't want that in this recipe.
Okay.
That's why I said literally, I mean, you can literally, I have used Jimmy Dean breakfast sausage for cooking savory recipes like this before.
Okay.
I don't want, you don't want fennel in everything. And fennel in sausage is a Southern thing, like a Southern Italian thing, Sicilian. And so most Italian recipes that have sausage are probably not Sicilian recipes and don't need the fennel. So here's what it looks like when it's done and ready to eat. So the last touch, there's two last touches. One is a swirl of olive oil. And then I'm gonna put on a teensy bit of Parmesan cheese. And then I'm sorry I've kept y'all here late.
We're okay with that. We're enjoying looking at the food and figuring out how we're going to cook it.
There it is. I'm telling you, I'm trying not to get my head cut off. The smell, honestly, just think of the sausage, the chestnut, the wine, and then those the mushrooms in here. It's just so fallish. This is fall in a plate.
Fantastic.
Ooh, wow, delicious.
Looks great.
Tomorrow you're getting the recipes, and I'm even going to give you some tips on where to get the chestnut flour so that y'all can all make all that.
Oh, thank you, Elaine.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm trying to,
I can almost smell it.
Almost.
Almost.
I'm
I've been
hungry.
able to get it on Amazon.
our friends at Oleo To Go also have, this is another good thing for you, by the way. So our friends from Oleo To Go are getting in a shipment of chestnut flour, and they are getting in a shipment of pasta already made with chestnut flour.
Wow.
Oh, really?
You don't have to make it yourself and deal with all that. You can just buy it, and I'll give you all the link for that tomorrow.
Okay, good. Yes.
Thank you.
Bravissima.
Thank you. That looks wonderful.
Ciao,
Thanks,
Lorenzo.
Elaine. That was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Grazie, Lorenzo. Grazie, Elaine.
Thanks,
Ciao.
Elaine. Thanks, Elaine.
Bye.
That's it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Arrivederci.
Ciao,
Thank
ciao.
you. Bye-bye.
Grazie.
Thank you.
All right, y'all, thanks for hanging in here with me. We did go long. I will see y'all next time. Tomorrow, recipes, and I'll let you know where to get the chestnut pasta. So it's good to see everybody, and I'll see y'all again next time. Okay? Ciao a tutti.